Thank you, Zakir. Because time is short, I'm going to just throw out some ideas. Bangladesh is at a stage where we have to change the direction of our economic strategy. And the direction of an economic strategy has to be implementable, and this is where the distribution of power comes in. Who has power in Bangladesh, and how do they exercise it? The concept of a political settlement is that your laws and institutions have to be aligned with the distribution of power. If the distribution of power, the people who are powerful do not want the implementation of your economic strategy, we can come up with the best economic strategy, it will not be implemented. Now, if I go back a little bit and say, why was Bangladesh successful for a pretty long period of time in generating jobs and generating manufacturing growth? Bangladesh came out of two partitions, one in 1947, when Bengal was split, and East Bengal was the less developed part of Bengal. In 1971, Pakistan was split, and East Pakistan was the less developed part of Pakistan. At that time, most economists and most politicians thought Bangladesh had no future. There was no future because it had no technology, it had no capitalists, it had very low levels of education. But over the next 30 or 40 years, Bangladesh actually grew rapidly. What happened? What happened was actually something that I've written about, and people did not expect it to happen, which is that the established elites were destroyed. In 1947, the landlord class, which happened to be largely Hindu, left. And in 1971, the old oligarchic capitalist class, allied with the military and the bureaucracy, who happened to be largely non-Bengali, left. So in 1971, here was a country where the old established elites had been shaken up, and then followed 10 years of chaos. There was a lot of fighting about who would become the new powerful groups. There were assassinations, there were coups, but out of that emerged a very broad-based capitalist class. It wasn't the narrow capitalist class that we find in India or Pakistan. It was a much more broad-based class which had come up from below. In a very simple sense, that distribution of power explains why in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, Bangladesh had a broad-based capitalist growth with thousands and thousands of garments industries coming up, small industries coming up, medium-sized industries coming up. At that time, Bangladesh was creating more jobs per percentage of growth than India. The share of manufacturing in Bangladesh was higher than in India. Women's participation in the labor force was higher than India. Why? Because the political system was responding to the middle of society and not to the top of society. If the middle of society is powerful, then these SMEs, these small enterprises, they come in and they create jobs. The tragedy of the Awami League period from the last 17 years, from 2009 onwards, was that that political settlement, that distribution of power, which through the previous two partitions had moved to the middle from the top, again moved back to the top. In very simple sense, the political settlement under Awami League shifted back to a oligarch-driven, small number of capitalists and bureaucrats and oligarchs set the economic agenda. That also produced growth, but it was not employment-generating growth. It was not broad-based growth. It was growth for the oligarchs, theft by the oligarchs, building infrastructure and roads at 2 or 3 times the price, building power plants which were 50% more expensive than our competitors, hiding all this behind unsustainable subsidies, hiding this behind the looting of banks, and then the whole system collapsed. And the system would have collapsed even if the student uprising hadn't happened. It would have collapsed in a more bloody and more economically costly way, because the economy would have imploded. It was going in that direction. So now the question is, where do we go from here? And the answer is that we must break the power of the oligarchs. And to break the power of the oligarchs requires very targeted actions. It requires the prosecution of several of them who have engaged in mega crimes and mega theft. We need to re-establish the ability of society to recover stolen assets. Progress on that has been very slow. We also need a very powerful competition policy. We are in the stage where the United States was in the early 20th century, when the robber barons had become extremely powerful, and the Sherman Act came along, and the Sherman Act was a product of progressive politics, and with the Sherman Act, the antitrust policy started breaking up the monopolies and started creating competition again. This is a permanent challenge of capitalism. Capitalism creates concentration of power. The concentration of power destroys politics. It results in oligarch-driven growth. And if you want to have a capitalist market economy, you must have the political will and the political ability to break down these monopolies and break down these oligopolies and restart competition from the middle again. The West is failing again to do that, and they have their own crisis. India has failed to do that. India is driven by oligarchs and a proto-fascist party. We had already also reached that system, but we have a chance of resetting it. We have a chance of actually doing some targeted prosecutions of these big thieves with a strong competition policy and restart a strategy of middle-driven growth. This was the secret of China's success. China's success was based on very large numbers of medium-sized enterprises in clusters of industries, and that is why manufacturing is strong in China. We need to have this middle enterprise-driven clusters of industries in Bangladesh, and that cannot be done without addressing the political settlement problem, without addressing the issue of the distribution of power. And that is why politics, economics, and foreign policy comes together, because that oligarchic regime in Bangladesh actually was kept in power through a lot of foreign assistance, including from our Indian friends. So this combination of geopolitics, domestic politics, and economic change has to come together. These are very complex issues. I have just thrown open the discussion. I have only 10 minutes to do that, but we will continue this conversation in Bangladesh over the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.